Hey everyone, welcome back to Plain Clothes Faith. I'm Nick, and I'm glad you're here. Over the last few episodes, we've been sitting in something slow: discernment, counsel, and waiting. We've talked about how formation happens in silence, how patience exposes what we trust, how resisting manufactured movement protects our discernment. And if you've been walking through this series, you can probably feel the tension building because waiting eventually changes. It doesn't remain static forever. There comes a moment when waiting feels different, not confused, not restless, but ready. And that's the quiet internal shift. That's what we're talking about today. This is episode 19, when it's time to move, recognizing the shift from waiting to obedience. So let's begin with a tension we have to hold carefully. Waiting builds faith, but staying when God says go erodes it. There's a holy patience, but there's also a fearful hesitation. And those two can look almost identical from the outside. So, how do we tell the difference? Let's slow down with a little bit of scripture. Think about Israel at the edge of the promised land. They had waited in the wilderness for 40 years of formation, 40 years of dependence on God for everything, 40 years of manna and movement. They had learned to survive with God, but survival was not the promise. The promise required movement. And when the land stood in front of them, something tragic happened. They hesitated, not because God hadn't spoken, not because the direction was unclear, but because fear had become louder than trust. Numbers 13 says, they saw themselves as grasshoppers. Their perception shrank their obedience, and they stayed. And that staying cost them another 40 years. Waiting had been holy, but when waiting became avoidance, it became disobedience. Now contrast that with Joshua. Different generation, same land, different posture. In Joshua 3, the priests step into the Jordan before it parts. The water does not move first, obedience moves first. Sometimes clarity strengthens when you step, not before. And that's the shift. And that shift is often not loud, it's often not dramatic, it's internal, which is why we need to look carefully at what changes inside you when waiting has done its work. But before we list all the markers, let's sit with another story. Nehemiah. Nehemiah was not a prophet in the spotlight. He was a cupbearer, stable job, comfortable, proximity to power, predictable life. And then he hears that the walls of Jerusalem are broken and something stirs. But notice what happens next. He doesn't resign. He doesn't announce a calling. He sits down and weeps. He prays for days, then weeks, then months. 4 months passed between the burden and the request to the king. The stirring did not immediately mean move, it meant pray. That's formation. And when the king notices his sadness, the moment comes. And Nehemiah speaks clearly, not impulsively, clearly, because the waiting had prepared him. His movement was not reactive, it was matured. And then the resistance comes immediately. Sanballat mocks him, Tobiah ridicules him, and opposition organizes. And Nehemiah keeps building, sword in one hand, tool in the other. Obedience did not remove tension, it intensified responsibility. But he did not retreat because waiting had formed him for opposition. Now, zoom out. Nehemiah's calling did not begin with ambition, it began with a burden. And this is where we need to slow down and look at this because we often misunderstand calling. We think calling is about destiny or platform or impact. But historically, Christian theology frames it differently. Martin Luther argued that vocation is not about status, it's about stewardship. Calling is not reserved for religious roles. Parenting is a calling. Work is a calling. Faithfulness in obscurity is a calling. Calling is where obedience meets responsibility. In fact, John Calvin built on this and taught that God assigns each person a post in life, a place of responsibility. You don't chase calling like a dream. You steward your post until obedience requires movement. That reframes everything because sometimes we stay too long because we're afraid, and sometimes we move too quickly because we're ambitious. True calling is neither avoidance nor ambition, it's surrendered obedience. In fact, Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote that when Christ calls a person, he bids them come and follow. End quote. He doesn't bid them to achieve, but to follow. And following sometimes means staying, and sometimes means stepping, but it always means surrender. So movement is not about advancement, it's about alignment. When your obedience and your position no longer align, tension builds. And tension is not always impatience, it may be readiness. So, how do you recognize that readiness? Several things begin to change slowly, not dramatically. First, your mind will quiet. Earlier in the season, everything might feel loud. Should I? What if? Maybe not. Maybe later. But when it's time to move, clarity settles in. James says wisdom from above is peaceable. Peaceable means steady, not adrenaline, but conviction. And the second thing that happens is convergence will strengthen, scripture will align, counsel will affirm, prayer will deepen your clarity, and your motives will stabilize. What once felt emotional will now feel anchored. And if something strengthens under examination, it may be time. If it weakens under testing, it was just an impulse. And the third thing that happens is fear will change its tone. Earlier, fear said, stay safe. Now, fear says, this will stretch you. But fear is no longer driving. Augustine described courage as rightly ordered love. When obedience becomes more valuable than comfort, you move, not recklessly, but willingly. And that brings me to my fourth point. The cost becomes acceptable. You stop negotiating. You stop saying, if this works out, and you start saying, if this is faithfulness, I'll go. Delayed obedience, once clarity has come, becomes resistance. Premature obedience before clarity becomes recklessness. And that's where discernment lives, is right there on that line between resistance and recklessness. And here's something important. Movement in scripture is almost always incremental. Abraham walked, and Nehemiah rebuilt section by section. The disciples followed one step at a time. You don't leap into destiny, you step into obedience. In fact, Dallas Willard reminded us that grace is not opposed to effort, but to earning. Movement requires effort, but not striving. You are not proving yourself or proving anything to anybody. You are responding to a call. And I just want to speak clearly for a moment. If you've been waiting faithfully, if you've prayed through the emotion, if counsel aligns, and if fear is shrinking, if clarity is steady instead of chaotic, it may be time, but not for drama, for obedience. And if resistance increases when you step, don't assume you missed it. Nehemiah faced opposition. Paul faced prison. Jesus faced the cross. Clarity clarifies calling. It does not eliminate the cost. And here's the final anchor that I want to give you in closing. Waiting builds trust. Movement expresses it. If God is saying wait, then wait well. If God is saying move, move humbly. Do not romanticize either. Both can be holy when surrendered. And next week, we'll talk about staying grounded once movement begins, because acceleration brings new temptation, and obedience must be rooted. This is plain clothes faith. No hype, no shortcuts, just faithful steps, one day at a time. Thanks for walking with me, and I hope I'll see you next week.